Hello, and thanks for joining me. Say what you will about Richard Dawkins, and I could say a lot. He has done a great deal to popularize the ideas behind evolutionary biology, publishing such books as The Selfish Gene and The Blind Watchmaker, not to mention his treatise on the overall evidence for evolution, The Greatest Show on Earth. When, as is not infrequent, he is challenged to a debate by a biblical creationist or other pseudoscientist, he is fond of giving the response which he attributes to Lord May of Oxford, a former president of the British Royal Society.
That would look great on your CV, not so good on mine.
A CV, or curriculum vitae, is basically a list of one's life accomplishments as a scholar, something like a resume. And to a creationist, getting an evolutionist to debate with them, to share a platform with them, is a great accomplishment indeed. It helps give the impression that there is a level playing field between evolution and creationism, which there is not. It gives the stature of creationism an elevation that it does not deserve. By contrast, a debate with a creationist on a scientist's CV is much like a debate with a flat earther on a geologist's CV, or a debate with a moon landing hoax theorist on the CV of an Apollo astronaut.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
It makes anyone who's interested in reading that CV in the first place wonder why such an accomplished person would waste their time. There are legends of primitive humans trying to join the ranks of the gods, or failing that to overthrow them somehow. This is the same attitude that creationists have towards science. They are trying to join the ranks of the scientists in order to legitimize their position in an increasingly skeptical and scientific-minded world. And if they can't do that, then they mean to overthrow the enterprise of science by painting it as just another mythology or just another system of faith-based beliefs. How ironic that creationists routinely accuse atheists of treating science as their god when they themselves are treating science as a sort of ancient pantheon. This is not to say that all debates between creationists and scientists are a waste of time. The debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, for example, gave us the brilliant moment when a member of the audience asked each debater what would cause him to change his mind. Ken Ham said nothing would cause him to change his mind. Bill Nye said evidence would cause him to change his mind. In the hands of a capable debater who not only knows biology but also knows the tricks and tactics of the creationists, such as the Gish Gallop, and is ready for them, a debate can accurately display the contrast between creationism and science. And since Bill Nye already had a slightly silly affect about him, and I say this with all the respect in the world for Bill Nye, with his bow tie and his caffeinated attitude and his branding of himself as Bill Nye the Science Guy, there wasn't much harm done with this debate. In fact, this dovetails nicely with the advice given by an internet commentator so long ago that I'm not able to trace the original source, that if you're an evolutionist who finds yourself roped into a debate with a creationist, your best strategy is to show up in a clown suit. This will demonstrate to the probably predominantly creationist audience the exact regard with which you hold the creationist community and their ideas. And with any luck, the more discerning members of the audience will be able to tell who the real clown is. Biblical creationism, also called young earth creationism, is the view that the earth was created in a 6-day period something like 6,000 years ago. Many believers in God are not creationists. In fact, it is very likely that most of them are not creationists. There is no need to subscribe to young earth creationism in order to maintain religious faith. In fact, many non-creationist believers report that seeing the products of science, the beauty and the harmony of the universe as revealed by science, only makes them that much more impressed with God. Isn't God clever to use such a grand and harmonious method of creating the universe as physics and evolution? Surely, such a God is just as capable of saving humanity as is a God who created the universe in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. And as for the accusation, which is probably true, that accepting evolution makes someone more likely to accept atheism, well, from an atheist perspective, I don't see anything wrong with that, but from a believer's perspective, I would say the fault for this trend lies squarely at the feet of the creationists. They have taught new generations of Christians that this is what the Bible teaches and that any other view is incompatible with Christianity. We know from looking at recent demographic trends that Christianity is doomed to become a minority in the United States sometime in the next 40 or 50 years. Imagine how much longer they could have held out if young creationists had been taught a form of Christianity which is entirely compatible with the results of science. The problem is, and again, this is from an atheist perspective, a plain text reading of the Bible does in fact support the creationist view. So you would basically need a whole new holy book, one that preaches the gospel of an old universe and of evolution. And now that humanity has left the intellectual dark ages and embraced an age of skepticism, it is unlikely that any new holy books will ever be produced and distributed to anything like the numbers of people who own copies of the Bible today. So maybe the creationists are entirely right to worry about the erosion of faith that science produces. But they have only themselves to blame. Science is not a series of propositions. Rather, it's a toolbox. And those tools, applied consistently and correctly, will yield the same results no matter where and when they are used. One apologetic argument that's been making the rounds lately is that if some cataclysm wiped out all knowledge of the Bible, we would be able to reconstruct it from non-biblical sources in our culture. That's how pervasive it is. That's how widely it's been accepted. In response to this argument, YouTuber Apologists reconstructed the entirety of the film Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, from non-Star Wars sources.
Chewie, hi. Luke Skywalker. How are you?
I'm Han Solo, captain of the Millennium Falcon.
He's remembered as the guy who made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs.
Greedo.
Sorry about the mess.
He thus demonstrated that the pervasiveness of a story is absolutely no indicator that it's anything but fiction. By contrast, if every copy of The Origin of Species and every paper written on evolution were destroyed tomorrow, we would be able to reconstruct evolutionary science without any kind of reference to pop culture. We could look directly at the evidence, the diversity of life, the geographical distribution of forms, the rocks, the fossils, and so on. If the Bible writers had known about the ancient age of the earth, they would have constructed their mythology to allow for it. Instead, it was left for later generations, those who do in fact live in an age of reason, to interpret what they have written. Now, when it comes to the theory that the earth is only 6,000 or so years old, there are many ways in which the tools of science tell us that this is simply not the case. And these conclusions are, to a scientist, obvious. One of my favorite ways of knowing that the earth is old, one that has only recently begun to get attention in the so-called debate between creationism and science, is the problem of heat.
Nice dissolve.
We know that certain elements undergo radioactive decay, that is, they change from one element or one isotope to another. Certain isotopes are unstable, meaning the atoms in those isotopes will spontaneously emit energy and become what we call daughter isotopes. For example, an atom of uranium-238, that is, a uranium atom with an atomic number of 238, will spontaneously emit energy and become an atom of thorium-234, which will in turn decay to an atom of protactinium-234, and so on. We know that the rate at which radioactive decay happens is measured in what's called a half-life. A half-life is a period of time in which half of a given amount of a given radioactive isotope will decay into its daughter isotope. We know the proportions between radioactive and daughter isotopes on the Earth, which is how we originally discovered that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. As I said, when an unstable atom decays, it spontaneously gives off energy, and this energy takes the form of heat. So, radioactive decay produces heat. There's a scene in the novel The Martian where the protagonist, stranded on Mars and awaiting rescue, uses a radioisotope thermoelectric generator with a bunch of plutonium-238 in it to actually heat up his Mars rover. Please don't try this at home. We know from looking at the data roughly how much radioactive decay has taken place over the history of the Earth, and therefore how much heat it has generated. And the answer is somewhat staggering. The amount of radioactive decay on the Earth since it was formed has produced enough heat to actually vaporize the entire crust of the Earth several times over. So why do we have a crust? Why aren't we all swimming in the mantle right now? Well, if you take that heat energy and release it gradually over a span of 4.5 billion years, say, then this allows enough time for the heat to dissipate and the Earth to cool. But if we compress that much heat release into a span of only 6,000 years, that is not enough time for the Earth's crust to cool itself and to continue to sustain life. There's a story in the Bible where Jesus walks on water, but there is no story about Jesus walking on lava, nor Moses, nor Abraham, nor Saul of Tarsus. They all spent their days walking on solid ground. Well, with one exception. The book of Genesis tells the story of the Great Flood, a worldwide disaster which was caused by God in response to the depravity of humankind. It was what can only be called an omnicidal event, killing all humans on the earth except for Noah and his family, who survived the event by waiting it out in a wooden ark. Biblical scholars estimate the flood lasted about a year, so the only time during which all the radioactive decay could be compressed into is the year of the flood. And if you release that much heat energy over the space, not of 4.5 billion years, not of 6,000 years, but of a single year, that would vaporize not just the crust, but the waters above it as well. So the data is inconsistent with the Earth being only 6,000 years old. The only way to get around this problem is to say that while the decay was going on, the Earth was supernaturally cooled by divine intervention. Or they could say that the decay never happened, that the daughter elements that we find all over the Earth, which can occur naturally only by radioactive decay, were put there artificially by divine agency. All such proposed answers to the problem invoke some kind of divine intervention or action. And that's the problem. Because if you're going to invoke divine action to save the hypothesis that the Earth is 6,000 years old, then you can just as easily invoke divine action to say that the Earth and everything on it, including me and all my memories, were created last Tuesday at around 4 in the afternoon. Why not? Any objections that might be raised to this hypothesis, such as we have calendars showing events that go back beyond last Tuesday, and certainly our memories go back beyond last Tuesday, can be answered by saying, well, God created it that way for his own mysterious reasons. Theologically, biblical creationism and last Tuesdayism may be very different, but scientifically, they are exactly the same. They are neither of them science. If a hypothesis must resort to non-empirical hypotheses in order to avoid falsification or alteration, then that hypothesis is not, cannot be, a scientific hypothesis. Creationists are fond of telling themselves and others that evolution is just a fairy tale, told by those who don't want God to exist and are looking for a way to lie to themselves about it. And when Charles Darwin had his innovative idea, the story goes, atheists were quick to latch onto it. Quite apart from the fact that we atheists are the best qualified to know what is going on in our own minds, and we know full well that nothing of the sort is happening, perhaps the most obvious clue that this is not the case comes from the fact that evolution by natural selection was discovered independently of Darwin by a naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. In fact, Wallace came up with the idea as much as 20 years before Darwin did, but he was reluctant to publish his ideas. He didn't have the wealth or social standing of someone like Darwin, and he knew how what was then such a radical theory would be received, even by the scientific community. He ended up co-presenting the theory of natural selection with Darwin at a meeting of the Linnaean Society, but was ultimately eclipsed by Darwin, in part because of the popular success of Darwin's solo work, The Origin of Species. But even before Darwin and Wallace, there were suspicions, hints, sometimes outright statements that evolution by natural selection, or something like it, must be taking place. As far back as the 14th century, the Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun wrote that humanity developed from what he called the world of the monkeys, in a process whereby species became more numerous. We know today, of course, that humans didn't come from monkeys, that humans and other primates have a common ancestor. But we see that as far back as 500 years before Darwin, someone like Ibn Khaldun, a good Muslim, was reaching for the basic ideas behind how life came to exist in its present form. In 1751, the French philosopher and mathematician Pierre-Louis Maupertuis wrote of modifications accumulating in biological forms over successive generations, resulting sometimes in new species. Another French thinker, Charles Bonnet, speculated in 1762 that females carry within them a miniature form, in his words, of future generations. It was he who first gave the word evolution its present meaning. Yet another French thinker around the same time, the Comte de Buffon, speculated that lions, tigers, leopards, and house cats might all have a common ancestor. He also calculated, based on observing pieces of iron cooling after being taken out of the furnace and comparing them to his ideas of the Earth cooling, that the Earth must be about 75,000 years old. We think today that that's way off, but it's also way off the timeline proposed by creationism. All the people I've been talking about preceded Darwin by decades or centuries. In fact, Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, suggested that all warm-blooded animals might descend from one living filament, as he called it. One of Erasmus's correspondents was the geologist James Hutton, who was among the first to deduce that the crust of the Earth, the shape of the rocks upon it, must have been formed by geological processes which were very slow and took a very long time. In fact, Hutton theorized that the geological history of the Earth was a divinely created process that went back not for thousands of years, not for millions of years, but forever. The result, he wrote, of our present inquiry is that we find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Hutton was perhaps the first to glimpse the truth of what we today call deep time. By the time of Darwin, the scientist Lord Kelvin had calculated, using better methods than the Comte de Buffon a century earlier, that the Earth was between 20 and 40 million years old. That's more than enough time to serve as a theological or philosophical escape hatch and get away from the truth of young Earth biblical creationism, if that's what non-creationists were trying to do. Bishop Ussher's calculations of the Earth as being 6,000 years old were already a couple of centuries in the past. But Darwin and other biologists pointed out that this probably wasn't enough time, not nearly enough time, for the full diversity of the Earth to spring from simple forms. They weren't interested in just getting away from old mythology. They were interested in actually finding out what is true. Evolution, like geology, is a gradual process, so gradual that it boggles the mind. There's actually a close parallel between creationism and flat earthism, in the way in which they both continue to appeal to a number of people. Just as our senses and our instincts tell us that the Earth must be flat, that it doesn't curve down into a ball as we get farther away, so too do our instincts and our senses tell us that species have a static form which they pass down to successive generations. Our primitive minds simply cannot handle the scales involved in time and space. It required the tools of science and empiricism to discover the truth. The same tools which enabled us to develop the technology by which I, and for that matter creationists and flat earthers, are creating these videos. There is no parity, no symmetry in the so-called debate between science and creationism. This is something that, again, the Nye-Ham debates made clear. Scientists will change their minds given evidence, while creationists will not change their minds at all. A popular trope in apologetics is to accuse atheists of wanting to be God. This is a big thing with someone like Frank Turek, who, in his debate with Christopher Hitchens, spent the entire closing section of his debate doing exactly that, accusing Hitchens and other atheists of wanting to be God. He said that atheists want to eliminate God so that they can be God, so that they can live the way they want to live. But living the way they want to live is exactly what creationists are doing. I have never once heard a creationist say, It's too bad that God exists because I would really like to be more accepting of the LGBTQ community. Or, I would like to be more tolerant of alternative points of view, but I can't because of that pesky God character. No creationist talks like that. The closest to that kind of talk I've ever heard was from a creationist named Kurt Wise, who today works for the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, but who started out with a very promising career in geology, which he had to abandon because he couldn't reconcile it with his creationist beliefs. If all the evidence in the universe, he wrote, turns against creationism, I would be the first to admit it, but I would still be a creationist because that is what the Word of God seems to indicate. Now, when you think about it, that's not a very meaningful statement, because it's a very short step indeed. From God teaches that creationism is true to the evidence doesn't, after all, show that creationism is false. But in Kurt Wise, we do see a prime example of a bright scientific mind destroyed, or at the very least, hopelessly corrupted by religious dogma. Dawkins wrote, "We have it on the authority of a man who may well be creationism's most highly qualified and most intelligent scientist that no evidence, no matter how overwhelming, no matter how all-embracing, no matter how devastatingly convincing, can never make any difference." Creationists choose their way of life. They may not choose whether they believe or not, but they choose to live in accordance with what they are told God wants. Specifically, the God that has been handed down over centuries and millennia of traditions. One of the myths from the book of Genesis was the story of how Abraham was told by God, or at least what he believed was God, to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he obeyed, getting as far as raising the knife above his child's body to strike the killing blow, at which point God came back and said not to do it and gave him a ram to sacrifice instead. This story has often been told to illustrate how virtuous Abraham was, how steadfast in his devotion to God, that he was willing to kill his only son. But in truth, if anything like this story actually happened in history, then it does not demonstrate any kind of virtue on the part of the person who almost did the sacrificing, but rather it tells a cautionary tale, a warning of how even a good person can be corrupted by religious fervor. This is what the new atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens are talking about when they say that religion poisons everything. So if you're looking for corruption in the world, don't look to the atheist, don't look to the scientist who wants only to discover what is true, no matter how frightening. Rather, look at those such as Abraham and Kurt Wise, who will not hesitate to take something good about this world and corrupt it, simply because they believe, or they are told by their leaders, that it's what God wants. If you enjoyed this video and want to help my channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to share your thoughts on the best way to debate or not debate creationists, leave a comment below. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. You help make this channel possible. If you'd like to become a supporter, check out the link in the description. Thanks as always for joining me, and we'll see you in the next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.